And now, the Deeper Thinking podcast, where philosophy, psychology, and power collide.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. There are moments in love when everything seems perfect, until something small, almost imperceptible, shifts. A glance, a laugh, a habit you never noticed before, and suddenly, something you felt drawn to now feels like a wall. A barrier between you and the person you thought you knew. We call it the ick. But what if this fleeting moment of repulsion holds something deeper? What does it reveal about us, our fears, our vulnerabilities, and our desire for connection? It's easy to dismiss the ick as trivial, but it has the power to expose the fragile space between attraction and rejection, between the ideal and the real. It asks us to confront the messy reality of intimacy, where perfection is impossible and acceptance is the only way forward. Let's dive in. Have you ever felt attracted to someone only for a small, almost absurd behaviour to turn you away completely? This is what we call the ick, an inexplicable sense of repulsion that sweeps in, casting a shadow over the connection we once felt. It's a moment that often feels absurd and shallow. How could something so trivial unravel an emotional bond so deeply? It might be a glance, a laugh, a particular habit, something minuscule that makes us recoil in disgust. But beneath the surface of this seemingly trivial reaction lies a deeper question. Why do we experience such intense repulsion in moments of attraction? Is the ick just an emotional quirk? Or does it speak to something more profound about who we are, how we love, and what we are afraid of? The ick, in its most simplistic form, is a sharp, fleeting moment of revulsion that interrupts what might have been a connection. The person we were once drawn to suddenly becomes repellent, and we can't pinpoint exactly why. It's as if the connection is shattered by an almost trivial act or behaviour, something so small that it feels out of proportion to the magnitude of our reaction. But the intensity of the ick cannot be dismissed. It isn't just an innocent turn-off, it's a deep, almost existential rejection that feels powerful and real, even if it seems absurd to outsiders. In many ways, the ick disrupts our idealized view of romantic attraction. We enter relationships with fantasies, expectations shaped by our desires, our anxieties, and our cultural narratives of love. We want to believe that intimacy is flawless, that the people we're attracted to are worthy of our affections in all ways. But the ick challenges this fantasy. It disrupts our idealization and forces us to confront the imperfections of the other person, and in turn, the imperfections in ourselves. There's something profoundly disorienting about the ick. It exposes the fragility of our desires and our judgments, revealing the thin line between attraction and repulsion. It challenges our understanding of love, intimacy, and connection, forcing us to reconsider the reasons we fall out of love. Why do we feel repulsed by something so seemingly insignificant? Could it be that the ick speaks to a deeper fear within us, an aversion to vulnerability, to intimacy, to the messiness of human connection? Or is it simply a reflection of our internal conflicts, our subconscious projections, and our need to protect ourselves from the pain of true emotional exposure? At its core, the ick is a mirror, a reflection not just of the person who triggers it, but of ourselves. It shows us our capacity for rejection, for distancing, and for creating barriers between ourselves and others. It reveals how we manage our emotional lives and how we navigate the complicated terrain of love and connection. But it also holds a lesson. It asks us to consider why we distance ourselves from those we are drawn to, why we reject intimacy at the very moment it is within our grasp. What does the ick say about our fears, our desires, and our need for control in relationships? And can we learn something from it that might lead us to a deeper, more authentic understanding of love? The ick is not just a modern phenomenon. It has cultural roots that run deep in our understanding of relationships, attraction, and love. In today's digital age, it is perhaps more pronounced than ever. With the rise of online dating, social media, and the endless stream of curated personalities, the ick has taken on a new significance. We are constantly presented with idealized versions of people, versions that are polished, filtered, and tailored to appeal to our preferences. But when the real person behind the image is revealed, the gap between expectation and reality can feel jarring, even if the discrepancy is small. Social media, dating apps, and modern forms of communication have created a landscape in which attraction is often based on snap judgments, instantaneous impressions, and curated profiles. This landscape, while offering new opportunities for connection, has also bred a kind of hyper-awareness in our interactions. The pressure to appear perfect, to be constantly attractive, to remain desirable in a world of infinite choices, has led us to become far more attuned to the smallest imperfections in others. The ick in this context becomes a natural byproduct of the idealization inherent in our online dating culture. We are conditioned to expect perfection, and when a flaw appears, even a tiny one, it disrupts the illusion, creating a ripple effect that often leads to rejection. But the ick doesn't just exist in the digital world. It reflects a broader cultural shift, one that places an increasing emphasis on surface-level attraction and instantaneous judgments. Our fixation on aesthetics, on how someone looks or behaves in the first few moments of a meeting, has become the standard by which we measure potential partners. The ick, then, is not just a personal reaction. It is a reflection of a wider cultural moment that places more value on immediate, visual appeal than on the messy, complex process of getting to know someone deeply. This cultural shift has ramifications beyond the realm of dating. It shapes how we view intimacy and relationships at large. When we are taught to expect perfection and immediate gratification, we are less likely to tolerate the imperfections that come with true connection. The ick is a direct consequence of this tendency to reject vulnerability, to avoid discomfort, and to protect ourselves from emotional risk. It is easier, after all, to dismiss someone over a minor quirk than to face the emotional complexity of real intimacy, the discomfort of sharing our flaws and accepting those of others. Yet, the ick also brings with it a kind of disillusionment. The very expectations we have about perfection, the ones that make the ick possible, are precisely the ones that often leave us feeling unsatisfied, unfulfilled, and disconnected. As we search for perfection, we miss out on the messy beauty of imperfection, the authenticity that comes from embracing the flaws of ourselves and others. The ick, in a way, challenges us to reconsider the values that underlie our romantic and interpersonal connections, forcing us to ask whether we are seeking real intimacy or just another fleeting, idealized fantasy. At the heart of the ick is a psychological defense mechanism, a subtle but potent form of projection. When we feel repulsed by someone, it's often not just because of their behavior, but because it reflects something within ourselves that we are unwilling to face. Psychologically, the ick can be understood as a form of displacement. The unattractive behavior or trait in another person is not really the source of our revulsion. Rather, it is a manifestation of our own unresolved issues, insecurities, or fears about intimacy. Freud's theory of projection offers a useful lens for understanding this. According to Freud, projection is a defense mechanism in which we attribute our own unwanted feelings, desires, or traits to others. In the case of the ick, the behavior that triggers our repulsion might remind us of something in ourselves, something we reject or feel ashamed of. Perhaps it's a behavior that mirrors our own vulnerability, our own desires, or our own shortcomings. The discomfort we feel in that moment is not just about the other person. It's about confronting an aspect of ourselves that we've been trying to avoid. Consider the way we often project our own fears of imperfection onto our partners. The ick can be a reaction to vulnerability, our fear of being seen fully by another person. When someone we are attracted to shows a flaw or vulnerability, it can trigger a deep sense of discomfort because it forces us to confront the very things about ourselves that we often try to hide. In rejecting them, we are, in effect, rejecting those same aspects within ourselves. This is why the ick can feel so disproportionate to the actual behavior. It's not about the other person's flaw, but about the uncomfortable feelings it stirs within us. This psychological dynamic also ties into our fear of intimacy. The closer we get to someone, the more we expose ourselves and the more vulnerable we become. The ick, in some ways, is a protective mechanism, a way of distancing ourselves from the emotional risk that comes with truly connecting with another person. If we can find something, however small, to repulse us, it gives us an excuse to retreat, to avoid the discomfort of intimacy. It's easier to reject someone over something trivial than to confront the deeper emotional work that a true relationship demands. But this defense mechanism can also prevent growth. By projecting our insecurities onto others, we miss an opportunity to explore and heal the very things that trigger our repulsion. Instead of using the ick as a moment of self-reflection, we dismiss it as a triviality and move on, leaving the deeper psychological work untouched. The ick becomes a barrier, one that prevents us from exploring the complexities of our emotions and the potential for growth in our relationships. Ultimately, understanding the ick as a projection allows us to see it not as a rejection of the other person, but as a reflection of our own emotional landscape. It shows us where we are vulnerable, where we are afraid, and where we need to grow. If we can learn to face the projections the ick reveals, we might discover new ways of understanding ourselves and others, and perhaps even begin to break down the walls that keep us from truly connecting. The ick also speaks to something deeper in the realm of human vulnerability and our fear of being truly seen. There is a sense, almost universally, that to be loved is to be fully exposed, our flaws, our quirks, our imperfections laid bare for another person to witness and ideally accept. Yet this exposure is often terrifying. The closer we get to another person, the more we are asked to reveal not just our positive qualities, but the parts of ourselves we wish to keep hidden. The ick, in this sense, becomes a defense against this vulnerability. It is a form of emotional distancing that protects us from confronting our own discomfort with being fully known. This is particularly evident in relationships where we have invested emotionally, where intimacy has begun to take root. The ick often emerges at the moment when we begin to see someone more clearly, not just as an idealized version of themselves, but as a real complex human being. It is in these moments of exposure that the ick can strike. Perhaps it's the way they chew their food, the way they speak about their past, or a small but irksome habit that we hadn't noticed before. These small things are often insignificant in isolation, but in the context of intimacy, they become magnified. It's as if the closer we come to another person, the more we begin to see the things that remind us of our own vulnerabilities. The ick, therefore, is not only a rejection of the other, but a rejection of our own fear of exposure. When we are repulsed by a trivial imperfection, we are often reacting to the discomfort we feel at the thought of truly opening up to another person. We fear the possibility of being vulnerable, of having our flaws and weaknesses laid bare for another to see. In that moment, the ick becomes a shield, a way of protecting ourselves from the emotional risk that comes with intimacy. It's easier to reject someone for something trivial than to face the terrifying possibility that in loving them, we might be exposing parts of ourselves we aren't ready to share. But the ick also highlights a deeper tension within the nature of love and intimacy. Love is, at its core, a process of embracing another person in all their complexity, their contradictions and their flaws. Yet, we are often drawn to idealize our partners, to see them as perfect in a way that aligns with our fantasies of what love should be. When the ick emerges, it forces us to confront the messy, imperfect reality of being in relationship with another human being. It challenges our illusions of perfection and reminds us that love, in its truest form, is not about perfection, but about acceptance. Acceptance of both ourselves and others, with all of our faults and quirks. In this way, the ick offers an opportunity. It is a chance to examine our own resistance to vulnerability and to reconsider our approach to intimacy. Rather than seeing the ick as a reason to distance ourselves from others, we might begin to view it as an invitation to confront our own fears, to explore why we recoil from the very things that make us human. It asks us to question whether we are truly open to the messiness of love, or whether we are seeking an idealized version of connection that ultimately leads us away from deeper, more authentic relationships. As we confront the ick, we begin to realize that it is not merely a reason to abandon someone, but a moment of self-reflection, a signal that something deeper within us is at play. It forces us to reconsider our expectations of love and connection. The ick may seem trivial, but its emotional weight can serve as an entry point into a more profound understanding of ourselves and our relationships. In rejecting the other person, We may be rejecting parts of ourselves, parts that we are afraid to confront, parts that we are. This moment of repulsion might be the exact moment we need to dig deeper into our own psyche to explore what lies beneath the surface of our zarfifus, our desires and our fears. By confronting the ick, we are presented with an opportunity to grow, to move past the idealized version of love and embrace the real, messy, often uncomfortable reality of human connection. It challenges us to accept not just the person in front of us, but also our own vulnerabilities and imperfections. The ick, in its essence, is a test of our ability to hold space for discomfort, for flaws, and for the beauty that can arise when we allow ourselves to be seen fully without the need for perfection. This moment of repulsion also calls attention to the underlying dynamics of our emotional lives. It exposes how we manage our fears of intimacy and how we protect ourselves from the risk of being truly known. The ick is a defense mechanism, but it is also a limitation. It prevents us from embracing the complexity of human connection, the vulnerability, the messiness, and the rawness that come with real intimacy. It is easier to walk away from someone because of a trivial quirk than to sit with the discomfort that intimacy demands. But in doing so, we deny ourselves the possibility of deeper, more meaningful relationships. Perhaps then the real question is not how to avoid the ick, but how to approach it. What if we could learn to sit with the discomfort it brings rather than running from it? What if instead of allowing the ick to create distance, we used it as an opportunity to move closer, both to the other person and to ourselves? In doing so, we might discover that the very things that repulse us are the same things that make us human, and that embracing those imperfections, both in ourselves and in others, could lead to a deeper, more authentic connection. In this way, the ick becomes a paradox. It is both a rejection and an invitation, a moment of repulsion that holds within it the potential for deeper understanding, growth, and connection. It challenges us to reconsider our approach to love, intimacy, and vulnerability, asking us whether we are willing to accept the imperfections of others and our own, if it means opening ourselves up to the messy, beautiful reality of human connection. In the end, the ick presents us with a paradox that doesn't have an easy resolution. It asks whether we can truly accept the inherent messiness of love, intimacy, and human connection. The experience of repulsion is undeniably uncomfortable, but it also holds the potential for something deeper. It can be a signal that we are confronting a part of ourselves, perhaps a fear of intimacy, a fear of vulnerability, or an unwillingness to accept the imperfections of others. This is where the ick becomes a moment of choice. Do we allow it to shut us down, to drive us away from someone we could otherwise connect with? Or do we confront it, sit with the discomfort, and allow it to teach us something new about ourselves and about love? The ick can be seen as a form of self-protection, but it is also a form of self-limitation. If we allow it to dictate our choices, we risk creating emotional distance not only from others, but also from ourselves. We may become so fixated on the need for perfection that we miss out on the deeper beauty of intimacy, the willingness to accept imperfection, to embrace the unknown, and to be vulnerable with another person. In rejecting the ick, we may be rejecting the very opportunity for growth that it offers. The ick forces us to confront our own fears, not only about the other person, but also about ourselves. It lays bare our anxieties about being truly known, about exposing our flaws and vulnerabilities. It challenges us to consider whether we are willing to open ourselves up to the messiness of relationships, the discomfort that comes with allowing someone else to see us fully, without the filters of idealization or fantasy. The ick, in this sense, is a mirror. It reflects not just the flaws of the other person, but the things we fear to acknowledge within ourselves. If we can learn to sit with the discomfort of the ick, to see it not as a reason to run, but as an invitation to go deeper, we might find that it leads us to a more authentic connection. It asks us whether we are willing to embrace the imperfections of others and of ourselves, to accept the vulnerability that comes with intimacy, and to let go of the need for idealized love. In doing so, we might find that the ick, far from being an obstacle, is actually a bridge, a pathway to deeper understanding, self-awareness, and emotional growth. Ultimately, the ick reminds us that love is not about perfection. It is about acceptance of the other and of ourselves. It forces us to confront the reality of human connection, where attraction and repulsion exist side by side, and where vulnerability and intimacy are not clean or comfortable, but are messy, raw, and profoundly transformative. The ick may not go away, but perhaps in embracing it, we can learn to navigate love and connection with greater authenticity, compassion, and openness to the complexities of the human heart. The ick, in all its complexity, offers an essential lesson about the nature of relationships and human connection. It is easy to dismiss it as a trivial, temporary feeling, a fleeting moment of disgust or discomfort that fades as quickly as it appears. Yet, when we step back and examine the emotional and psychological layers beneath it, the ick begins to reveal a profound truth: that love, intimacy, and vulnerability are not clean or straightforward. They are messy, imperfect, and sometimes deeply unsettling. The ick, rather than being an obstacle to connection, may actually be the moment where real intimacy begins to take root. When we confront the ick, we are given an opportunity to see ourselves more clearly. We are invited to reflect on what it is within us that causes such a reaction, what insecurities, fears, or unresolved emotions are being triggered. In this way, the ick acts as a kind of mirror, reflecting not just the flaws of another person, but the parts of ourselves we often shy away from, our fears of imperfection, our anxieties about vulnerability, and our discomfort with being truly seen. Rather than a reason to pull away, the ick can be a moment of self-discovery, an invitation to explore the deeper parts of our psyche that we may not be fully aware of. In relationships, we are often drawn to the idea of perfection. We want our partners to fulfill certain ideals, whether physical, emotional, or psychological. Yet the ick challenges these ideals. It forces us to confront the fact that no one is perfect and no relationship is flawless. The perfection we seek in love is a fantasy, a projection of our desires and expectations. The ick, in a sense, is a reality check, a reminder that love is not about the absence of flaws, but about accepting and embracing them. It teaches us that intimacy requires us to look beyond the surface, to accept the messy and imperfect nature of the people we are drawn to, and to acknowledge our own imperfections as well. However, acknowledging the ick does not mean we should embrace it uncritically. It is important to understand when the ick is a sign of something deeper, when it reveals a fundamental incompatibility or a red flag that cannot be ignored. Not every moment of repulsion is an invitation to explore or grow. Sometimes the ick serves as a necessary boundary, a signal that something is not quite right. But even in those cases, it's worth asking why we feel repulsed. What is it about the other person or about ourselves that triggers this reaction? In the end, the ick asks us to challenge our assumptions about love and connection. It pushes us to reconsider what it means to truly accept another person, not as an idealized fantasy, but as a complex, flawed human being. It asks us whether we are willing to confront our own vulnerabilities, to sit with discomfort, and to engage with the messiness of intimacy. If we can learn to approach the ick with curiosity rather than avoidance, we may find that it leads us to a deeper, more authentic understanding of ourselves, our relationships, and the nature of love itself. Ultimately, the ick is not just a momentary reaction. It is a lens through which we can better understand our own emotional landscape and how we approach intimacy. It serves as a reminder that love, at its core, is not about perfection, but about acceptance, accepting both ourselves and others in all their flawed, imperfect, and sometimes uncomfortable glory. The ick shows us that intimacy isn't about being free of flaws or discomfort, but about being willing to be vulnerable enough to allow someone to see us at our most unguarded, to share the messiness of our existence without fear of rejection or judgment. When we experience the ick, we are confronted with a choice. Do we reject the other person for their flaws, or do we take a deeper look at what those flaws reveal about our own fears, insecurities, and desires? Do we run from the discomfort, or do we lean into it and allow it to teach us something valuable? The ick may feel like a barrier, but it is also an invitation, a chance to deepen our understanding of ourselves, of the person in front of us, and of the complex dynamics that shape human relationships. By embracing the ick rather than running from it, we can learn to navigate the complexities of intimacy with greater authenticity. We might discover that the very imperfections that initially triggered our repulsion are the same imperfections that make the other person human, just as our own flaws are what make us uniquely ourselves. Accepting the ick means embracing the contradictions of love, acknowledging that attraction and repulsion often exist side by side, and that both are necessary for true intimacy to thrive. As we move through the world of relationships, we are constantly searching for connection, for validation, for love. But the ick teaches us that real love doesn't come from a place of idealization or perfection. It comes from the willingness to accept the full range of human experience, the beautiful and the ugly, the tender and the painful, the joyous and the uncomfortable. The ick reminds us that love is messy, and that's precisely what makes it real. It is not something to be feared or avoided, but something to be embraced, even in its most imperfect forms. In the end, the ick forces us to reconsider what it means to truly love another person. It challenges us to move beyond superficial judgments and to embrace the full complexity of human connection. It asks us to let go of our need for perfection and to accept the inherent messiness of being in relationship with another person. And in doing so, it offers the possibility of a deeper, more authentic love, one that is not based on idealized fantasy, but on acceptance, vulnerability, and the willingness to grow alongside one another. As we conclude this exploration of the ick, it's clear that this seemingly trivial phenomenon has far more to teach us than we might have initially realized. The ick is not just an impulsive reaction to something minor. It is a profound reflection of our fears, desires, and vulnerabilities. It exposes the tensions that lie at the heart of all human connection, the pull between attraction and repulsion, the desire for intimacy and the fear of exposure, the longing for perfection and the acceptance of imperfection. In rejecting the ick, we risk shutting ourselves off from the very essence of what makes us human. We are flawed, messy creatures, and our connections with others are equally imperfect. The ick asks us to embrace this imperfection, not just in others, but in ourselves. It challenges us to accept the full range of human experience, to lean into the discomfort that intimacy often brings, and to recognize that true love is not about perfection, but about accepting one another in all our complexities. By facing the ick head-on, we learn to navigate the messiness of love and connection with greater authenticity and compassion. We move beyond idealization and superficial judgments, recognizing that the flaws we find in others are often reflections of our own fears, insecurities, and unresolved emotional baggage. When we can acknowledge these projections, we open ourselves up to deeper, more meaningful relationships, ones that are grounded in vulnerability, acceptance, and growth. The ick, in this way, becomes an invitation, a chance to reflect on our emotional landscape, to confront our fears of intimacy, and to grow into more authentic versions of ourselves. It is a call to move beyond the fantasy of perfect love and to embrace the reality of imperfect connection. And in doing so, we create space for love that is richer, more complex, and ultimately more fulfilling. So the next time the ick strikes, instead of seeing it as a barrier to intimacy, consider it a doorway, a moment to explore what lies beneath the surface, to face your own vulnerabilities, and to discover the deeper truths about yourself and your relationships. Love is messy, uncomfortable, and imperfect, but it is in that messiness that we find the most profound connections, the most authentic intimacy, and the truest sense of what it means to be fully human. Until next time.
This episode of the Deeper Thinking podcast was written, produced, and researched by Benjamin James. It was read by Holly, a digital narrator. For further reading, resources, and a chance to support the show, visit the episode webpage, where you'll find book recommendations, key topics to explore, and a way to buy me a coffee. And if you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on your preferred platform.